Trump just announced one of the largest tax increases in American history, probably since at least the 1960s, with his tariff announcements. I know that you were watching closely as he made those announcements and looking at his charts, and I'm not an economist, you are, but I was looking at those charts, going, where is he getting these numbers that he's claiming that other countries are imposing tariffs on us? Where exactly is he getting these numbers from? And I think you might do a better job of explaining exactly how he got those numbers than I did.
Yeah, so the numbers that they ended up using for the tariffs, which they're calling reciprocal, but which are not, because they're not actually a reciprocal tariff would be to say, well, what tariff do they charge us? We're going to charge the same thing. Apparently, his advisors had calculated those numbers, but they didn't end up using them. What they used was a very simple formula where they said, how much is this country selling to us? How much of our imports from that country? And then we're going to look at what the trade deficit is, which the deficit is the difference between how much we sell to them and how much we buy from that country. And then we're going to take that trade deficit divided by the total number of goods we import from them. And that'll give you a percent. It might be, 50%, or it might be for some countries 90%. For some, it might be a surplus, though. And then once they have that percent, then they said, let's divide it by two for apparently extra confusion, or maybe I think Trump likes to say, "Oh, I'm a business guy. I'm giving you a discount or something," or maybe appear nice. But the numbers are not actually in relation. They do come from some trade data, but they're not actually imposing the same rate that that country charges us. And this is very true in some cases, such as South Korea. We have a free trade agreement with South Korea, and the actual tariff rate that we charge them, or that they charge us, is less than 1%. If you take all the things we sell to them and of the few remaining tariffs we have, because free trade agreements are never perfectly 100% true, it's less than 1%, and they're claiming it's 50%. That's what their rate is, and then they're dividing it by two to get 25% that we'll put on them. But these numbers, I don't want to say they're made up and they're from nowhere, but they're not what they said, and they're not what the chart said. When he pulled out that chart, I said, "What?
Right.
What are these numbers?
I had to look it
Where
up.
are these coming from?"
The claim says, tariff is charged to the U.S., and then underneath it in little print it says including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So it's listing three things. Does this number have anything to do with actual tariffs charged? No. Does it have anything to do with
No.
currency manipulation data? No. Does it have anything to do with trade barriers? No. I think that we have the means to calculate these numbers, don't we? Of how much trade barriers cost when we're trying to import or export, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, there is very good data on this, especially on the actual number of the tariff. I mean, you can calculate this, and a lot of organizations have done it, both for the average rate that a country charges all other countries, and you can calculate what it is for country to country. Calculating how much is due to non-tariff trade barriers and currency manipulation, that actually is a little harder. The rumor is that his administration did try to make a calculation based on those. They apparently gave Trump a menu of options of here's one way to do it, here's another way, and he apparently liked the one he actually did, which is not reciprocal. It's not based on what the chart said it was based on. And people pretty quickly figured this out within hours what it was. And then they later that night admitted, yeah, that's what it is. It is based on trade data, but not having really anything to do with the tariff levels, right? What they are saying, the U.S. Trade representative has said, is that, well, this number, approximates the effect of all those things, right? Assuming the assumption there, though, is that without all these, we would have perfectly balanced trade with the other country. But that is not true either. Some countries, like I said, we have a trade surplus with, like Australia. We have a trade surplus, meaning that we sell more to Australia than we buy from them. And even countries where it seems like Guatemala, which makes a lot of T-shirts and other goods, we actually have a trade surplus with Guatemala. So I think that the assumption that without tariffs and other trade barriers and manipulations, the assumption that it would be perfectly balanced it's just not true. That's not the way the world works.
I can't help but look at what their claims here and think that this is mostly propaganda. They are trying to sell the tariff rates that they want, right? By claiming that South Korea, for example, has a 50% tariff on our goods that are coming into South Korea, they're then able to bump up our tariffs on South Korea to 25%. it seems like that's the only motivation behind the data. And as I'm sure you've seen, if you
Right.
have somebody who's motivated to have certain numbers be the outcome, well, they're going to find a
Yeah.
way to make that
Yeah.
happen.
One other thing I should mention is that to kind of add on to what you're saying is even for countries that we have a trade surplus with, or countries where we have a small trade deficit, where that number would end up being less than 10%, they're still putting a 10% tariff on those countries. So they're putting a 10% at least tariff on every country, even if there's a small trade deficit or a surplus, which, drives home the point that this isn't an attempt to get countries to lower their tariffs. Because even if you did, number one, the tariff rate will still be the same because it's based on this other calculation. The trade deficit would have to shrink with that other country for that number to go down in the future if they're going to adjust these. Who knows? But also, even if he says these countries are ripping us off if we have a deficit, but even countries that aren't ripping us off in his terms, they're still getting slapped with a 10% tariff, including countries like Australia that we have a free trade agreement with Australia too.
It reminds me of there's one little island in off the coast of Canada that's owned by France, and they apparently sold us about $3 million worth of probably lobsters. And the Trump administration apparently is claiming that they are ripping us off because they only bought $100,000 worth of American goods, and they sold us $3 million+ of lobsters. And it's like, well, that's not how ripping off works. If somebody has a surplus of something and you buy from them and they don't buy anything from you, you don't call that being ripped off. When you go to the grocery store and you say, hey, I want some potatoes, and you pay $10 for those potatoes, the grocery store
Yeah.
isn't ripping you off if they don't go and buy whatever your business is selling, right? That's
Yeah.
that's how the
Yeah,
market
that's
works.
the yeah, that's the right way to think about it at the individual level. You buying from businesses, or think about within the United States, right? If Arkansas is buying a lot of pineapples from Hawaii, but Hawaii is not buying rice from Arkansas, like that doesn't upset anyone, and no one even makes a big deal of that because it may just be true that from some states we might buy a lot of stuff from them, but they might not buy a lot of stuff from us, but we buy it from them because we value it more than the dollars we give up, right? Just like when you buy anything, there's no difference here when it comes to international trade. And I think that was, Trump really acknowledged this error he's making when he started talking about Canada and saying, well, we have a trade deficit with Canada, but if they become our 51st state, no more trade deficit. But there might actually still be a trade deficit between Canada and other US states. But he seems to think that if you're part of the same country, magically that doesn't matter when the same exact trade could be going on as before.
Yeah, I heard him described as a mercantilist, and that seems to be a far more accurate descriptor of what he's trying to accomplish than anything else. We've already seen China match our tariff rates. They had I believe the average tariff rate with China was around 7%. We imposed the 34% tariffs on it. China has now matched that. Can you give us any sense of where this might go? Do you think is somebody one side or the other going to blink at some point? How far does the market go down before Trump goes, okay, maybe we should back off a little bit? Do you have any kind of sense of what of where it'll go?
Well, predictions are always hard, especially about Donald Trump. But I think that we have seen a couple countries, Vietnam and Israel, I saw, who did announce they're going to lower tariffs on the U.S. Even I think before the announcement came out of these rates. So maybe some countries will react that way, but certainly China is obviously not going to react that way. Canada clearly seems like they're not going to. The EU seems like they're not going to either. They're going to retaliate against us, and I think that this can go on. And we have seen in the past trade wars. During the Great Depression is the best example of this happening and having really bad effects. During the Great Depression, countries, in an attempt to both try to protect their economies and try to raise some revenue because governments are losing revenue during the Great Depression, countries started putting tariffs against each other. But what we know now is this just made the Great Depression, which was already happening and bad, it just made it worse, and it ended up being something which after World War II, after you get to the Depression and World War II, that's when the modern system of trade rules was set up because a lot of people recognized the mistakes that were made during the Depression. So what was called GATT at the time, and now what evolved into the WTO in the 1990s, that was a result of countries coming out after World War II and saying, we messed up during the Great Depression, and we want to create a sustainable, peaceful world, and part of that peaceful world is going to be trading with each other. And that is the world that existed from the end of World War II up until Trump's first term, essentially. And so I think that we don't know how long it'll go on, but we do know that the longer it goes on, the more pain there will be.
Trump also made the comment that the one of the reasons why the Great Depression happened, and according to him, was because they didn't continue the tariffs. While I mean, even in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's the famous scene where he's talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariff and how that was one of the instigators of the Great Depression in it. And you know, Trump seems to throw this on its head. You talk to any historian or economist about this issue, and I'd guarantee you that 99 point something percent would say no. The Smoot-Hawley tariff absolutely exacerbated the Great Depression, and if it had continued, it would have made things even worse. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're exactly right. In fact, I wrote a paper recently with Marcus Witcher and Phil Magnus on how college textbooks treat the Great Depression, and how are they summarizing what economists say and so on. And so we went through what's the consensus on different points, what do textbooks say, and there is some disagreement among economists about certain facts of it. But the one thing that there's the most consensus on through both surveys of economic historians and the output of the research on this topic is that the Smoot-Hawley tariff and other tariffs made the Great Depression worse. Not that it caused it, and there was the most important fact, but that it made the Great Depression worse. That is, you are correct, that is what there is the strongest consensus we have about any economic point during the Great Depression is that the tariffs made it worse.
It seems to me that we are entering a period of time where the experts having a consensus on something is proof or evidence that they are all conspiring against it. I hope we wake up and realize that that's not always the case.
Yes, yeah, the experts, yeah. I get what you're saying there, but I think on this one we can say, well, the experts actually do disagree on lots of things, which shows that they don't all have the same biases. They aren't all maybe using the same methodology or framework, but on this point they agree. So I would say that's actually reason to believe them on this point. But I know the distrust of experts. There's some reasons for that, and maybe especially in the Trump administration they distrust experts. But I think that we probably should, even if we don't totally trust the experts, Trump's reading of history is probably not the right one to follow.